Hello, and welcome to our online lecture for Psychology 1101 and Psychology 1010 at Lanier Technical College. My name is Michael Holman. I am a psychology instructor here at Lanier Tech, and I will be your narrator. Please note that these lectures are intended to assist you in better understanding the material and should not be considered a substitute for attending lecture, reading the text, or completing your assignments. So we're going to start with what is psychology. And I always like to start by talking about some expectations throughout each lecture. So we are going to define psychology, describe the various fields and subfields of psychology, describe the origins of psychology, and identify those who made significant contributions to the field. We will identify theoretical perspectives of modern psychologists toward behavior and mental processes, and we will describe modern approaches to research and practice, things like critical thinking, the scientific method, and ethical considerations. So true or false? More than 2,000 years ago, Aristotle wrote a book on psychology with contents similar to your own textbook. That is true. The ancient Greek philosopher Socrates suggested a research method that is still used in psychology today. That is also true. Men received the majority of doctoral degrees in psychology. That is false. It is actually women. Even though she had worked to complete all the degree requirements, the first female president of the American Psychological Association turned down the doctoral degree that was offered to her. And that is true. You could survey millions of voters and still fail to predict the outcome of a presidential election. That is true. We have seen that in recent times, actually. In many experiments, neither the participants nor the researchers know who is receiving the real treatment and who is not. And this is also true. So we're going to start with psychology as a science. Well, what is it? Psychology is the scientific study of behavior and mental processes, so both what you do and how you think. Psychology seeks to describe what we do and what we think, to explain why people do what they do, to predict what a person will do next, and to control behavior and mental processes, so sometimes to manipulate what you will do in the future. And this leads us to a very important concept in science in general, which is a theory. A theory allows you to propose reasons for relationships, to derive explanations, and to make predictions. So a theory is more than just a guess. It has a lot of scientific evidence to back up whatever it is that you're claiming. So that leads us to the next question. What psychologists do? A psychologist will either conduct research, practice, or teach. So among research, there are two different kinds. There's pure research and applied research. Pure research is when a psychologist is studying information just to find out why. It is knowledge for the sake of knowledge. I wonder why blank happens when people do blank. Well, let's go find out. Let's go study it. Let's go research it. That is pure research. You're just answering the why question or the how or anything like that. Applied research is taking that pure research and applying it to the field. So if you have research that suggests that a certain technique is very useful for helping people overcome depression, then applied research would be applying that technique to clients in the field that already suffer with depression and seeing if there is a change. So that's the difference between pure and applied research. Practice means therapy. It means taking all of this research and using it to help people. And the last one is teaching. Teaching is exactly what it sounds like. It's what I'm doing right now. It's what your instructors do. It is taking the information and then sharing it with the next generation, with students just like you. There are many fields of psychology. This slide doesn't even encompass half of them. But these are some very important fields of psychology, and I'll discuss a few of them in detail. So we'll start with clinical psychology. Clinical psychology is a field of psychology in which you give out diagnoses for any sort of mental disorder. Counseling psychology is more mainstream. This is providing a listening ear, providing counseling services to clients. And this can be for any number of reasons, like I'm super stressed out right now, I just started school, I'm feeling really sad lately, I've lost my motivation, any number of things. All of this is part of counseling. Usually when people think of a therapist, they're really thinking of a counselor. For example, my degree is in clinical counseling psychology, and that means that I can both diagnose people with mental disorders, but also counsel people on day-to-day situations. So you'll see this a lot where many psychologists like myself will double dip, and so we'll have two different fields or even more different fields of psychology that we are involved in. School and educational psychology. Now, a lot of people will think that these are guidance counselors, but actually they're there to determine whether students have maybe a learning disorder, or if they might be intellectually deficient, or if they're gifted, any number of tests such as that. A school psychologist will work with one particular school and service the students at that school, while an educational psychologist will service the entire school system. So it's micro versus macro, essentially. Developmental psychologist is a psychologist that monitors your development. If you've ever known a little child that goes to get certain milestones checked, those milestones were discovered thanks to research done by developmental psychologists. Personality psychologists study your personality, and that's one thing that you'll want to learn very quickly in psychology class, is that a lot of times our terms mean exactly what they look like. So a personality psychologist studies your personality. So we don't really get too deep most of the time with our terms. A social psychologist is a psychologist that studies society. They study how society can influence the individual. Peer pressure, obedience to authority, why do good people do bad things just because someone told them to? We have a whole chapter dedicated to them. It's a really cool field. Environmental psychology studies how your environment, so where you were born, where you currently live, how that environment shapes your personality, how it affects the decisions and opinions that you have about the world around you. Experimental psychology conducts experiments. Again, it's exactly what it sounds like. Then we get to industrial psychology. So industrial psychology is broken down into three separate fields: organizational, human factors, and consumer. So these really can be summed up as psychologists that work with companies in order to increase productivity, to increase revenue. So these are the people that help companies make more money. For example, have you ever wondered why candy and batteries and sodas and bags of chips are sold at the cash register? We call them impulse buys. Psychologists, industrial psychologists, are the ones who came up with that term. They were hired by, say, the candy company to help them increase, how much candy was being bought. And they determined through their experiments, through their research, that the best way to get people to buy more candy was to put it at the cash register at the end of their shopping experience, because they realized, as an impulse buy, that people were more likely to buy candy on their way out of the store, just something to grab as they exit, as opposed to having to go to a specific shop or go to a specific section of the store and seek it out that way. And what do you know? Money soared. So all sorts of different things working within companies to help them make more money and to have their employees be more productive. That is an industrial psychologist. Health psychology focuses on the effects of stress on your body. That we know, as you'll see in the stress chapter, there is good stress that motivates you to do more, called eustress, and there is bad stress, which can lead to things like cardiac arrest and stroke. And so health psychology studies the effects of stress on your physical health. So it studies the effects of something purely psychological and how that will affect you physically. Sports psychology is interesting. A lot of students aren't aware that this field exists, but sports psychology is when you have psychologists specifically there to help athletes, professional athletes, be the best that they can be, to perform at the best of their ability. That is a sports psychologist. So, a lot of money is invested in these athletes, and we want them to be at their peak, not just physically, but also mentally, so that their head's in the game, so to speak. So you would be hard-pressed to find any professional sports team in the NFL and the NHL, MLB, it all goes on and on. All of those big organizations, every team, you can bet there is a team of sports psychologists there to make sure that their athletes are performing at the best of their ability at all times. And then the last field of psychology is forensic psychology. So with this field, many students immediately will picture something like the show Criminal Minds, where you have this team of psychologists are part of an elite unit, and they get on a special airplane and they fly all over the country solving crazy serial killer murders and things like that. And apparently there's a surprising number of serial killers in the United States, enough for a weekly television show. And they will go into a crime scene and they'll look around and they'll, go, oh, from what I can tell, I believe the unsub has white skin. They are a white male. They are in their late 30s to early 40s, and they grew up in a very rural environment, perhaps a farm. And then you, the viewer, are sitting at home going, what? How did they possibly know that? Whoa! Well, I hate to burst your bubble, but that is not a forensic psychologist at all. That is something called criminal profiling. And that is a neat party trick that literally any psychologist can do. Criminal profiling is simply looking at the data that we have gathered about criminals and then determining what kind of person is most likely going to commit this crime. So if you're wondering how did they know all that information about the unsub, it's because of all the serial killers that we have captured that we know about, the majority of them were white, male, in their late 30s, early 40s, and grew up on a farm or something. Like, it's not magic or anything, it's just statistics. So that is not what a forensic psychologist does. So what do they do then? Well, a forensic psychologist is actually just a professional witness for the courts. So they will be called in to testify to determine whether they think that the defendant is insane if they're pleading an insanity defense. They'll help determine if a defendant is competent to stand trial. They can help to determine if a defendant understands what is happening to them, that they are in court, that they understand the seriousness of the charges. If the defendant says that they have a specific disorder, the psychologist can determine whether that is correct or not, or if they're lying, or whatever. So that is what a forensic psychologist does. They are an expert witness called in by the courts when it comes to psychological matters. Moving on, we've talked about different fields of psychology. Now let's focus on the history of psychology. Where did it come from? Well, it started as just a neat party trick, really, that philosophers could do. Big names like Aristotle and the book that he wrote on the idea of psychology, the PSYC, Democritus, and even Socrates, who was the first person really to talk about the concept of introspection, which means to look within oneself in order to better understand yourself. So look within in order to better understand yourself. So it was just a philosophy sort of party trick that we could do back in the day, but it wasn't until 1860 that psychology became a science, a laboratory science. This was thanks first to Gustav Theodor Fechner, who wrote The Elements of Psychophysics in 1860, and then Wilhelm Wundt, who created the first psychology laboratory in 1879. So yes, both of these guys were very German, and they were the first people to take psychology away from philosophy and apply scientific principles to its study. Wilhelm Wundt is the first man we want to talk about in the classic psychologists. he came up with a field known as Structuralism. And this school of thought breaks conscious experiences into objective sensations, like your senses, subjective feelings, like your emotions, your willpower, and mental images, memories, dreams. So it's all your personal experience. Structuralism believes that the mind functions by combining objective and subjective elements of experience. William James is next. He's an American, and he came up with the school of functionalism. Functionalism focused on behavior in addition to your mind and your consciousness. So now, not just studying what you sense and what you're aware of, but also what you do. It used direct observations to supplement introspection, so it was more than just you telling me how you feel right now. And it was also influenced by Darwin's theory of evolution. From functionalism, which was about how you function, we move on to behaviorism, started by John B. Watson and B.F. Skinner. And as the name implies, this school of psychology focuses purely on your behavior, focuses on learning observable, measurable behavior. I always tell my students, behaviorism doesn't give a crap about your feelings. It doesn't care about your thoughts. It doesn't care about how you feel about something. It only cares about what you do and what it can make you do next. And if you ask B.F. Skinner, he would say that learned behavior is behavior that is reinforced or encouraged. So we have a whole chapter on these guys, so you'll see them a lot more in the future. Next we have Gestalt Psychology. This was by a bunch of German guys. The big names are Max Wertheimer, Kurt Kofka, and Wolfgang Kolyer. Gestalt Psychology focused on perception and its influence on thinking and problem solving. Perceptions are more than the sum of their parts. It is active and purposeful, and it focuses on insight learning. So Gestalt Psychology was all about how you perceive the world around you, how you perceive yourself, and then how that perception changes the way you think and the way you solve problems. One of the big things that Gestalt psychologists like to talk about is the importance of context. How when you perceive something, it can change based on added information. For example, if you look at these blue circles on the left here, and if I ask you to tell me which of the center circles is larger, you would probably say the one on the right. It certainly looks it. But if I take those outer circles away, as you can see, both are actually the same size. The only thing that changed was the context. So you see, in the previous ones, there were smaller circles around the circle on the right, but there were larger circles around the circle on the left. So because of that, you see the circle on the left as smaller, and you see the circle on the right as larger. But as you now know, they are in fact the same size. Next, let's talk about this little yellow square. If I asked you to read the top line for me, you would most likely say A, B, C, D. And if I asked you to read the bottom line, you would most likely say 12, 13, 14, 15. Except that you would be wrong, because that top line is not A, B, C, D. It is actually a 13. So why did you read that 13 as a B? Well, it's because of the context. Because it was among a series of letters, and it was even in alphabetical order, you automatically perceive it as a B, even though it's not a B. So that's just another example of the importance of context. And then if we look at this last one, then we might ask you, well, which of the squares in the middle, the gray squares, is a darker shade of gray? And you're probably familiar with my tricks by now, but to just go over it, you know that you'd probably think that the shade of gray of the square on the left is darker. But as you know, that would be incorrect. They are, in fact, the same square, the same shade of gray. This is just another example of context. It took the darker shade around the left square and the white around the right square to alter your perception of the squares in the middle. So that is the importance of context according to Gestalt Psychologist. So next we're going to talk about insight. Insight is that light bulb above your head moment, that aha, I figured it out moment. And Gestalt psychologists love this, but they're not the only school of thought when it comes to insight. One way that we have studied insight is with chimpanzees. We might put them in a room with a bunch of bananas taped to the ceiling, and obviously the chimpanzee wants to get to the bananas, but he can't reach it, not even if he jumps. But eventually he realizes that he can take those boxes and stack them on top of each other, and now he's got his bananas. That moment when he realizes he can use the boxes that are in the room to get what he wants, that is insight. That's that aha moment. Another field of psychology that uses insight is psychoanalysis. Big name here is Sigmund Freud, and he is probably the most famous psychologist ever. In fact, of all the names that I've said today, he's probably the only one that you recognize. Sigmund Freud came up with the school of thought known as psychoanalysis, which looks at the influence of unconscious motives and conflicts. He also developed a theory of personality, or how our personalities are developed. And he's the first person to take all of this knowledge that we've been gathering with our research about psychology and applying it to helping people. He is the first psychologist to use psychology for therapy, to help others. So that was how classical psychologists view behavior and mental processes. Let's now look at more modern views. And the first modern view is the cognitive perspective. It is concerned with the ways we mentally represent the world and process information. It looks at things like memory, perceptions, learning, problem solving, decision making, language, and planning. A good rule of thumb, anytime you see the word cognitive, it means thinking. So cognitive equals thinking. I would definitely write that down. So anytime you see cognitive, it means we're talking about thoughts. We're talking about your mental situation. So what is your mental perspective? Another school of thought is humanistic and existential perspective. Humanism stresses human capacity for self-fulfillment, so the role of consciousness, self-awareness, your ability to make decisions. And existentialism is a school within humanism, and it stresses free choice and personal responsibility. So existentialism is all about having free will, but that also meaning that no one is responsible for your actions except for you. And the big names for existentialism, who we'll meet in later videos, is Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow. Next we have the psychodynamic perspective. So Freud was the big person for psychoanalysis. Psychodynamic perspective is actually much later. The psychodynamic perspective is the more modern view of, well, Freud's ideas. These people are called neo-analysts, and they focus more on conscious choices and self-direction than psychoanalysis. Big names that you'll see later are Karen Horney and Erik Erikson. From behaviorism, the modern view that we look at when learning about, well, learning, is the social cognitive perspective. And this perspective believes that people modify and create their environment, and that people learn by observation. This leads us to something known as the Sociocultural Perspective, which focuses on the influence of differences among people in behavior and mental processes. So it focuses on ethnicity, gender, culture, and socioeconomic status. Here is another word that you're going to see a lot, so I would write it down. Socioeconomic status. Anytime you see this word, and it might be abbreviated as SES, but anytime you see socioeconomic status or SES, we're talking about your financial situation. How broke are you? How much money you got? So if I say someone has low SES, that means that they are very poor. If someone has high SES, it means that they're very rich. So they have a lot of money. So the sociocultural perspective, then, is looking at the ways your ethnicity, your gender, your culture, and your financial situation all interact in order to affect what behaviors you perform and the way you think about the world around you. When studying diversity within psychology with the sociocultural perspective, something that many more sharp observers might have noticed is that all of the big names of classical psychology that I've been talking about up until this point were a bunch of old white guys. There were no women, there were no people of color, and it wasn't until people of color broke into the field that we started studying the effects of ethnicity on people. It wasn't until the names like Kenneth Clark and Mamie Phipps Clark, or Jorge Sanchez, Lillian Gomez Diaz, or Richard Swin, it wasn't until they came around that we realized, oh, people might actually be different because of their background, because of their race, or where they come from. And so they did research on that particular topic. Similarly, it was a bunch of old white guys that we've been talking about up until this point. And it wasn't until women entered the field of psychology that we started noticing a difference mentally between men and women that wasn't just a bunch of sexist conjecture. And so the big names for that are Mary Whitton Calkins, Mary Salter Ainsworth, and Elizabeth Loftus. Several of these you will see for other sections later on. Okay, so for this next section, we're going to be talking about how psychologists study behavior and mental processes. This is of particular interest for Psychology 1101 students. Psychology 1010 students, this is still going to be on the exam, and this is still going to be important, but Psychology 1101 students, when you are studying the research chapter, which is a separate chapter, refer to this section of this video. So, when talking about research, we need to talk about certain principles of critical thinking. Critical thinking is something that you should apply to every aspect of your life. So, this is really taking information, any information, but especially scientific data, and thinking about it critically. Not just saying, oh, well, this person told me X, so I'm going to believe it. You're not taking anybody's word for it, essentially. You're wanting them to prove it. So here are those principles. Number one, we want you to be skeptical of whatever someone is telling you. Always. Just be a skeptic. 2, insist on evidence. Next, examine the definitions of the terms used in that evidence, and then examine the assumptions or premises of the arguments that this person is making. Be cautious in drawing conclusions from evidence. So just because the evidence looks like it's pointing one way, that doesn't mean that we should necessarily assume that that is the case. Only make a conclusion based on what you know, not what you can assume. Assumptions are bad. Consider alternative interpretations of research evidence. You know, someone might be presenting information to you in a certain way. Well, maybe there's a different way of looking at it. You know, they might not be aware of a different perspective. It is also important when seeing evidence that you do not oversimplify what you are reading, so don't condense it so much that it loses all meaning, and don't overgeneralize. You know, a lot of this information is only going to apply to specific people in specific situations. And the last one is the most important. Apply critical thinking to all areas of your life. Just do it. It's really helpful. It helps you to be more aware of what is entering your mind when learning about different aspects and different research avenues. So, psychology as a science relies on what every science relies on, the scientific method. And this involves formulating a research question or asking yourself, I wonder why XYZ happens. Once you have this question, you are to state a hypothesis. Your hypothesis is your educated guess. So this is what you think is going to happen based on the research that you got from looking up your research question. Then test your hypothesis. So now that you think that blank is going to happen, test it. Conduct an experiment and see if it happens. Then, based on the results of your testing of the hypothesis, draw conclusions based on the findings. So you can conclude based on your results your hypothesis was correct or incorrect, whatever it is. Then you publish your research. This is the scariest part of the scientific method, because now you are putting your results out there for everyone else to see. And we get to the most important part of the scientific method, which is to replicate the study. So what happens is you will publish your research, and then all other psychologists are going to read that research and go, I wonder if that's right. And then they're going to try and recreate your study. They're going to replicate it to the best of their ability, exactly like you made yours. And if it's exactly the same and they get the same results, then that supports whatever your results were. But if they do it exactly the same way and they get something different, then that means that your results were not good. And so it's back to the drawing board for you. And so we will replicate your study over and over and over and over and over again. And this is why certain scientific theories are more powerful than others. There can be one theory that has a couple of studies behind it, but then there are theories like gravity, like evolution, where these are theories, scientific theories, that have been tested over and over and over and over and over again. And we keep getting the same result every time. That's pretty conclusive evidence. That is the importance of the replicating of the study part of the scientific method. We are always skeptical, even of each other, in science. And that is why we are constantly trying to prove each other wrong in order to find out if we are right. This is just a breakdown of the scientific method to help you better understand how it works. So what happens is you might have a psychological theory, you might have daily experiences or commonly held beliefs. You then, based on whatever that may be, will formulate a research question or come up with a hypothesis. If it's a research question, you'll examine that research question, and based on your examinations, get evidence. You'll have observations. If it's a hypothesis, you will test that hypothesis, as we've already talked about. Once you've gathered your evidence or your observations, you will then draw a conclusion, then create a theory or modify an existing one, which will lead you to new research questions or new hypotheses. And this really is the main feature of the scientific method, is that we are always seeking out more information. We're always trying to learn new things. That is the most important aspect of the scientific method. Every answer we get from one of our theories just leads to more questions. And so we then create those questions, and then we get more answers, which leads to more questions. And on and on and on it goes. Is that we are always trying to learn more. That's the point of science, is to learn about the world around us. We're wanting to understand everything going on around us, and the scientific method helps us to do that. Every answer we get should lead us to another question so that we can better understand ourselves and the world around us. When we study people as psychologists, we have to look at both the samples and the populations. For example, if I wanted to find out attitudes towards chocolate of American citizens, well, all United States citizens would be considered my population. It is not possible for me to survey every person in the United States. There's just no way. You got people hiding out in the hills and in the mountains, and some people just don't feel like taking the survey, so there's no way to get everybody. So what am I supposed to do? Well, that's a sample for you. The sample is the group of people that you actually did get to take your survey. So I would try to get many people that are Americans to take this survey, and they would be a sample of the overall population. Representative samples allow generalization of findings. So if I wanted to find out how all Americans feel about chocolate, but I only asked white women, is that a representation, an accurate representation of all Americans? No, absolutely not. It is not representative of the different kinds of people that make up the American population. So we want to make sure that our samples are representative of our overall population, or else they don't really tell us anything useful or helpful. Samples can be representative in one of two ways. It can be either random, where every member of a population has an equal chance of selection, or it can be a stratified sample, where we have subgroups represented proportionally. So for example, if I know that in this population 46% are white and 26% are black, and then another percentage are remaining ethnicities, then I would make sure that my stratified sample of that group has 46% that are white and 25% that are black, and so on, etc. So you're just making sure that the same percentages apply. With random sample, it's just random, whoever you want to be in it. It's, think of it like standing outside Walmart and saying, here, take my survey. Here, take my survey. Here, take my survey. Here, please take my survey. That's random. You don't really control how many of what group is getting it. One thing that we have to keep in mind, though, when we are doing these surveys is volunteer bias. This is a bias represented by studying people who volunteer to participate. So, think of it this way. One of the surveys you'll learn about in this class was the National Sex Survey, where we asked Americans all over the country all the nitty-gritty details about their sex lives. We got as much detail as we possibly could. The kind of person that is willing to tell me, a complete stranger, all the details of their sex life is probably not representative of every person in the United States, right? So that's what we have to be aware of, is that when we are doing these surveys and getting these samples, the kind of person willing to give us these answers is not necessarily going to be representative of every person in your population. So we just have to take these results with a grain of salt, essentially. So there are a number of ways to gather information, to observe this information. You could do a case study, where you gather information about individuals or small groups, usually used to investigate rarities. Case studies are really interesting because this is when you study something that doesn't normally happen. You may have heard of stories of people being raised in the woods or raised by wolves or anything like that. Well, in those cases, they would be a case study, a case-by-case basis, where we are seeing what happens to this person who had this unique situation. Ethically, I cannot just take a baby from an orphanage and throw it in the woods and then see what happens. Not going to happen, right? So instead, I see what has happened in this particular case. A survey is what students in Psychology 1101 are going to be doing. Psychology 1010 students will not be doing this. But in 1101, you'll be taking a survey and giving it out to participants. This is used to collect information that cannot be observed directly. So things like attitudes, opinions, all sorts of stuff. That's what 1101 students will be doing. So if you've ever taken a survey asking about what your favorite color is or anything like that, then you have participated in that method of observation. Another method is naturalistic observation, where you observe subjects in their natural environment in an unobtrusive way. So this means that you are in the wild, you are in the jungle, you are in the prairie, and you're watching animals, or you're watching your human subjects, and you're not messing with them, you're not interfering, you're just watching how they behave in their natural environment. This is important because think back to figures like Jane Goodall. She was a very famous scientist that actually lived among gorillas in the jungle for years. That was naturalistic observation. She did not mess with them. She tried her best not to interact with them. That was all naturalistic. She didn't want to bother them. She just wanted to see how they lived in their natural environment. It's much different from being in a lab. Think of it also like this. Have you ever watched any of those animal documentaries like Discovery or Nature Planet or anything like that, Blue World, things like that, where you've got this cute little animal and it's like a puppy or a cub or something and it's adorable, and then the next scene you hear the narrator and he says, "The lion cub would later starve to death." And you're like, why? Why would you let them die? Why wouldn't you interfere? You've just been filming them for their entire life. And you're thinking, this is so sad, right? They're so heartless. But the thing is, this is naturalistic observation. That's what would have happened if those cameramen were not there. We're just happening to see it for the first time. So you're just watching what nature would have done if we didn't know it was happening in the first place. So that is naturalistic observation, to not interfere, but to watch subjects in their natural environment. Now, when studying different relationships between things, you're going to see a term called correlation. It is the mathematical method of determining a relationship between variables. And here's another thing you're going to want to remember, especially Psych 1101 students. Correlation is a relationship. It's just talking about the relationship between two things. Those things are known as variables. So a variable can be anything. It can be your age, your gender. It can be your opinion towards chocolate. It can be your attitude on whether you prefer cake versus pie. Anything is a variable. And correlation just measures the relationship between two variables. So the relationship between your gender and whether you like chocolate or not. But one thing you need to remember about correlation, and this is incredibly important for everyone, is that correlation does not equal causation. Just because there is a relationship between two variables does not mean that one variable caused the other. So for example, did you know that 100% of all serial killers were breastfed? Does that mean that all serial killers became serial killers because they were breastfed? No, of course not. That would be silly. But it simply means that there's a relationship. There is a correlation between the two variables. That's all we're talking about. One does not cause the other. Now, there are different kinds of correlations. They can be positive or they can be negative. If a correlation is positive, then it means that both variables are going in the same direction. For example, look at this graph on the left. It's about intelligence test scores compared to grade point averages. As intelligence test scores go up, so does your GPA. This is essentially saying that as one goes up, so does the other. That is a positive correlation. Immune system functioning and levels of stress is what we see on the second graph. That is an example of a negative correlation. As one variable goes up, the other variable goes down. So negative correlations are when the variables go in the opposite direction. Positive correlations are when the variables go in the negative direction, or they go in the same direction. So a positive correlation, they're going to go the same way. Both go up, both go down. Negative correlation, one goes up, the other goes down. If that one goes up, the other will go down. And on and on and on. When talking about different variables, there are two types that you will want to remember. There are independent variables and there are dependent variables. An independent variable is a variable that doesn't change. It just stays what it is, and your participants are just reporting it. Your gender is an independent variable. As a scientist, it would be unethical for me to change your gender. I can't change your age. I can't magically make you 85 because that will fit better with my research. No, you just are what you are. That is an independent variable. We're not changing anything there. A dependent variable is a variable that changes depending on, well, whatever the independent variable is. So the independent variable will actually change the dependent variable. So if we're looking at attitudes toward ice cream and we're comparing those attitudes towards gender, you might say, or you might find that more women prefer ice cream than men. Gender was the independent variable in that example, and preference for ice cream was the dependent variable. So that can change depending on who we look at. All experimental methods have groups, and groups are either experimental groups, this is the group being experimented on, or control groups. Control groups are groups that are being monitored, but no experimentation is done to them. So, for example, if I have developed a magic hangover pill that takes away hangovers right away, then the control group would be the group of participants that I've now given a hangover in some way, and I don't do anything with them. I just let them have a hangover. The experimental group would be the group that gets the pill. And so I compare the people that don't get the pill, the control group, to the people that did get the pill, the experimental group, and compare their time. So the control group had a hangover for X amount of time. The experimental group, their hangover went away after X amount of time. And we're seeing, was it faster? Did the pill work? The problem, though, is that a lot of times our experiments might find themselves dealing with placebos. Placebos are fake pills. They don't actually do anything. They might be sugar pills or a pill of aspirin, but the point is that they don't actually do anything. They are fake. But they develop something called the placebo effect, which you may have heard of. The placebo effect is when you believe that what you are experiencing is the result of the pill, even though I, the researcher, know that the pill was a fake. So if you are stressed out and you take a pill and you immediately feel better, it wasn't the pill that did it. It was your belief that the pill would make you feel better. And the belief is what made you actually feel better, not the pill itself. So that's the placebo effect. A great movie, that one of my favorites, that really demonstrates this well is the movie The Birdcage, and it's with Robin Williams and Nathan Lane, and there's a great scene where Nathan Lane's character is having a serious fit, and he's really stressing himself out, and so he asks his assistant to give him some of those Pirin pills. They always calm me down. And so his assistant gives him some, and Robin Williams pulls the assistant aside and says, "What the heck are you doing? What are you giving him? What is that Pirin stuff?" And the assistant says, "Oh, it's nothing, don't worry about it. I just take some aspirin and I shave off the AS." So Nathan Lane was just taking aspirin the whole time, but he thought he was taking a new pill that would help him with his headaches. And so he was experiencing the placebo effect. So the problem, though, is that what if I'm giving out a pill that is supposed to help you with your hangover, and you believe you're getting a pill that will help you with your hangover even though you're really not? How do I know that it's the pill that's taking away your hangover and not the placebo effect? What do I do? Well, in order to fight this, I might use a blind study. And this is where nobody knows whether they're getting the hangover pill or if they're getting the fake pill, the placebo. In this way, because the participants don't know what pill they're getting, we're hoping that the placebo effect won't take place. And so in someone that really did get the hangover pill, their hangover goes away because of the pill, not because of the placebo effect. But the problem with that is that we're dealing with humans. And sometimes if a human knows they're going into a, say, hangover cure study, then when I give them the pill, they're going to think, oh, this is the hangover cure. Even if it's a fake pill, whether it's real or not, they have convinced themselves that it's the hangover pill. So because they will believe that, we can't make them blind. So we don't know whether the placebo effect is what's healing them of the hangover, or if it's, well, the pill itself. So the way that we counteract that is through the double-blind study. This is when the participants have no idea who is getting what, and the researchers handing out pills have no idea who is getting what. The idea is that maybe the researcher accidentally gave something away in their body language or something like that, but by the researcher not knowing who is getting what pill, and the participants already not knowing, then nobody knows. There is actually a third guy in another room that the participants never met, and this is the one who knows that this participant got this pill and this participant got this other pill. So we still keep track of it, but the people handing out the pills are just as blind in knowing what happened. So that's an example of a double-blind study. This is one of my favorite experiments. It's called the Lang study. And in the Lang study, they wanted to really test the power of the placebo effect. So they knew that the taste of vodka is very similar, if not identical, to the taste of tonic water. Basically, participants won't know if they're drinking tonic water if they're drinking a glass of vodka. So, participants were broken down into two groups. Half of the participants were given vodka to drink, and half of the participants were given water to drink. half of the participants were told that they were drinking vodka. The other half of the participants were told that they were only drinking water. So let's see how this broke down. So if a participant believed that they were drinking vodka and they really were drinking vodka, they got pretty drunk. If a participant believed that they were only drinking water, but they were really drinking vodka, then they might have been a little tipsy, but they weren't so bad. If a participant believed that they were drinking water, and they really were only drinking water, then they were sober. Perfectly fine, nothing weird about that. But if a participant believed, and this is my favorite part, if a participant believed that they were drinking vodka, but they were only drinking tonic water, they acted the drunkest. So they were the most drunk of the entire group. And this just goes to show the effects of belief on a person's behavior. So very interesting stuff. So when researching with humans, we have to think about ethics. We have to think about morals, really. What is the right thing to do? And in modern times, we have developed what's called an ethical review committee with ethical standards. And they are there to make sure that for every experiment, individual dignity, human welfare, and scientific integrity are maintained so that we are not being cruel to people, that no harm is going to come to a subject. As you will see in many examples in psychology throughout the semester, psychologists are the worst. We are the biggest jerks, absolutely. And before we had ethical review committees, we did horrible, awful, terrible, no good things to a lot of people. So this is something that is definitely necessary. Some of the things that the ethical review committee requires is informed consent, meaning that the participant knows that they're signing up for a psychological study, and they know what kind of study it is. So they know what they're getting into, basically. Confidentiality, meaning that any results that I get are maintained as confidential. They're kept secret. So no getting your survey results from your participants and then posting their results on Facebook for everybody to see. No, that's bad. So it's maintaining that level of secrecy and privacy. Deception. In some cases, as you will see throughout the semester, deception is necessary, where we lie to participants about what they're actually doing. And it is okay as long as no physical harm comes to them. But even if there is deception, there must always be debriefing. Debriefing is when we let the participant know what's actually happening. So if we lied to them, we come clean. So by the end of the experiment, they've been debriefed and they know exactly what really went on. When researching with animals, things are a little bit different. Animals are used when research cannot be carried out with humans. And in this case, an animal may be harmed, but only if there is no alternative and the benefits of the research justify that harm. So for example, if we have developed a miracle cancer drug and we just need to test it out to make sure that it works, we can't use that on a human. You can't go to a cancer patient and tell them, we think that this drug will cure your cancer, and then they take it and it doesn't cure their cancer or it makes it worse. How you're going to explain that to them, huh? That's not good, right? So you can't just throw this onto humans. But what we could do is maybe have some mice and give the mice cancer. And that sounds awful, sure, but then we can test the cancer drug on those mice, and then the mice will either get cured of their cancer, and in which case they're fine, or the mice will not be cured of their cancer, in which case we have lost a mouse, but we have not necessarily given false hope to a 6-year-old struggling with leukemia. So hopefully you see the difference there. So yes, it can be a little awful, but sometimes we have to make sure that the benefits of the research, of all the people that we could save from this research, will justify the harm that we are doing. Now, that said, we do know of a lot of animal research that is not ethical. You know, you hear about things like makeup testing, cosmetic testing, all that sort of stuff. That is a debate for another day, but for now, we know that in psychology, we are focused on ethically treating animals as best as we can if we need to use them in our research to help other humans. And that is it for this particular lecture. Please make sure that you are completing all of your assignments by the due date, and I will see you next time for the next psychology lecture.